Hello, and welcome back to episode 3 of Gallivanting Across British Cultural Studies. In this episode, I'll be covering Chapter 3 of Graeme Turner's book, British Cultural Studies and Introduction. Chapter 3, titled Texts and Contexts, provides a very lengthy and detailed explanation of British cultural studies history with textual analysis, moving from the original literary impetus of the field, then to Stuart Hall's encoding-decoding model, and beyond. Without further ado, let's get into it. The most recognizable and possibly the most important theoretical strategy cultural studies has developed is that of reading cultural products, social practices, even institutions as texts. However, this was not an overnight development, and it wasn't really until the late 1960s and early 1970s that the modifications and methodologies adopted began to occur and allowed for the reading of text as such. This was largely due to the importance of semiotics. This also coincided with sort of the second wave of media analysis. If the first was derived from literary studies, then the next found its initial stimulus elsewhere, in sociology, particularly in sociology's interest in the mass media's role in the construction of social and political consensus. Novel scholarship from this time deployed semiotic and structuralist methods of textual analysis and Althusserian theories of ideology, both of which were sort of the definitive contemporary markers of British cultural studies. The result from all this was an increased focus on social meetings and on the political implications of media messages. This combination, a legacy of the mixed parentage of literary studies and sociology, gave the cultural studies tradition of textual analysis its distinctive character, both in theory and in practice. While it's difficult to point to any singular moment as the definitive shift to this mode of analyses, it's customary to use Stuart Hall's important article, Encoding and Decoding in Television Discourse, as a turning point. In it, Hall makes a conclusive break with the hitherto dominant American communication models, with aesthetics and with the notion of the audience as passive consumers of mass culture. Instead of the straightforward methods of delivery which these theorists sought, Hall points out that just because a message has been sent, there's no guarantee that it will arrive. Every moment in the process of communication, from the original composition of the message, encoding, to the point at which it is read and understood, decoding, has its own determinants and conditions of existence. Hall insists that there is nothing natural about any kind of communication. Messages have to be constructed before they can be sent. And just as the construction of the message is an active, interpretive, and social event, so is the moment of its reception. Society is not homogeneous, but it is made up of many different groups and interests. Thus, the television audience cannot be seen as a single, undifferentiated mass. It is composed of a mixture of social groups, all related in different ways to dominant ideological forms and meanings. So there is bound to be a lack of fit between aspects of the production and the reception processes, between the producers and the audience's interpretation of the message, that will produce misunderstandings or distortions. This potential for misunderstanding is limited by the fact that our communication systems, both the linguistic and the non-linguistic, work to encode our languages for us in advance. To quote Hall, certain codes may, of course, be so widely distributed in a specific language, community, or culture, and be learned at so early an age that they appear not to be construction, the effect of an articulation between sign and referent, but to be naturally given. As Hall goes on to clarify, the more natural a code appears to be, the more comprehensively the practice of coding has been disguised. Because of this, visual communication appears not to be composed of discourses at all, since its signs appear to be natural images of the real world. It is absolutely necessary to emphasize the fact that the visual sign in the television message has to be encoded too. Indeed, visual languages work like any other languages. To the extent that visual languages may fool us by appearing to be natural, it is crucial to crack the codes, interpret them, and release their social meanings. Of course, all of this provides us with a slightly contradictory model. And Hall deals with this contradiction by arguing that the television message may be polysemic, but it is not totally pluralistic. That is, while there is a degree of openness about its meanings, there are also limits. If meanings are not entirely predetermined by cultural codes, they are composed within a system that is dominated by accepted codes. On this, Hall says, the different areas of social life appear to be mapped out into discursive domains, hierarchically organized into dominant or preferred meanings. This notion is important because it emphasizes the fact that dominant meanings are not irresistibly imposed, they are only preferred. So, readers from social groups who find themselves at odds with these dominant meanings may well resist them in their own interpretations of the television message. So, for the creator or the encoder of this text, actual signifying practices involve a kind of performance, a calling up and deployment of what one considers to be the appropriate codes and discourses. In order to enforce these dominant meanings, it consists of the work required to do so, win plausibility for and commend as legitimate a decoding of the event within the limit of dominant definitions in which it has been connotatively signified. Hall next considers how the audience's relation to these limits might be better understood, drawing upon the work of sociologist Franklin Park. Hall identifies three hypothetical positions from which the decoding of a television message may be constructed. He calls these dominant hegemonic positions, or as it is more widely described now, the preferred reading, the negotiated position, and the oppositional position. To read the message from the dominant or preferred position, the viewer takes the connotated meaning from, say, a television newscast or current affairs program full and straight and decodes the message in terms of the reference code in which it has been encoded. It's become clear that while such a position does exist or might exist theoretically, it very rarely occurs in practice, as the majority of us read television by producing what Hall calls negotiated readings, which accord the privileged position to the dominant definitions of events while reserving the right to make a more negotiated application to local conditions. Because of this, Hall argues that the negotiated reading will be shot through with contradictions. Finally, we have the oppositional reading. Here, the viewer understands the preferred reading being constructed, but retotalizes the message within some alternative framework of reference. This is the case of the viewer who listens to a debate on the need to limit wages but reads every mention of the national interest as class interest. We occupy this position every time we witness a political broadcast or advertisement for the political party we usually vote against. Here's where the nuance arises, and Hall sees these three positions as anything but discrete. He talks of the most significant political moments being the point when events which are normally signified and decoded in a negotiated way begin to be given an oppositional reading. The structured polysemy of messages makes their specific reading at any one time a political struggle between dominant and subordinated meanings. Given the context of today, the real importance of the encoding-decoding article lies in its demonstration that although the moments of constructing and reading a television message may be determinate moments, there is still a range of possible outcomes in both cases. Not only does Hall insist on the possibility of a lack of fit between these codes used by the encoder and those used by the decoder, but he does also insist on explaining this distinction in ideological political terms. Hall suggests that such moments are not accidents, but are the signs of structural differences produced and determined by other social or economic or cultural forces and made available for analyses in the reading of the television message. Where the earlier notion of the effects of the media localized the meaning and the effect of the message in the individual reader, the encoding-decoding model defined media texts as moments when the larger social and political structures within the culture are exposed for analyses. Looking at the article today, one can see how strongly it asserts the polysemic nature of the message, and how presciently it alludes to new conceptualizations of the television audience. In the years to come, in the 70s and early 80s, most British cultural studies analyses of television examined the ideological and discursive work Hall mentions from a particular perspective, concentrating on the ways in which the contradictions and divisions within society are smoothed over or naturalized within specific television programs and genres. Cultural studies analysis of the media generally emphasize the construction of consensus, the reproduction of the status quo, and the irresistibility of dominant meanings. So although the idea of the passivity of an audience was dismantled in favor of the preferred, negotiated, and oppositional reading models, the application of these models tended to construct an audience that was, nevertheless, still helpless before the ideological unity of the television message. Although the theoretical possibility of aberrant readings was always admitted, the primary effort was put into establishing just how difficult, how aberrant, such readings in practice would be. The power of the text over the reader dominated this stage of media analyses. From this era, Brunson and Morley would be emblematic of this type of analyses in their critique of the BBC program Nationwide. They stress how actively Nationwide works to present itself as a simple reflection of the way its viewers see the world. To quote them, "If Nationwide presents itself as catching in its varied and comprehensive gaze everything which could possibly be of interest to us and simply mirrors or reflects it back to us, what is more, it sees these events in exactly the same perspective and speaks of them in exactly the same voice as its audience. Nationwide thus naturalizes its own practice." In this 1978 paper on the program, Brunson and Morley demonstrate how actively and successful Nationwide's constitutive codes and discourses construct a consensual preferred view, not only of the meaning of the program, but of its definition of society. Another force, the Glasgow Media Group, produced work during this time which has shown how media will always seek out opinion from those persons or groups already almost automatically authorized to speak. Those people being parliamentary political parties, employers groups, trade unions, and so on. On any one topic, the range of interests canvassed and explanations sought will in practice be limited to those already recognized and legitimated by previous media representations. Occasionally, this range can even be further restricted. In the late 70s and early 80s, the Scottish group's research revealed that in at least one case, no union or workers' explanation of the purpose of a crippling strike in Scotland was ever broadcast on the television news to counter government and employers' group accusations. In commenting on this, Hall and his group would take the research a little further to say that not only are certain groups recognized as having a voice and others not, but the system of recognition is dramatically skewed in favor of parliamentary's definition of politics. On this, he says, television reproduces selectively not the unity of any one party, but the unity of the parliamentary political system as a whole. Related to this, the Glasgow group focused on the media representation and discussion of green politics within the parliamentary system. They found that despite its persistence and resourcefulness, it's only where green politics have been accepted within mainstream, that being electoral or parliamentary politics, that the media represent its definition of issues as legitimate. To once again quote Hall, "The media remains a leaky system where ideological reproduction is sustained by media work and where contradictory ideologies do in fact appear. It reproduces the existing field of the political class structure in its contradictory state. This does not obscure the fact, however, that the closure towards which this sometimes teeth-gritting harmony tends overall is one which, without favoring particular positions in the fields of the political class struggle, favors the way the field of political struggle is itself structured." Obviously, research and analysis along this lens has a clear political bent, but it's important to note that the political objectives of cultural studies analysis of the media during the 1970s were significantly, and in general, overshadowed by the novelty and productiveness of the analytical methods employed, at least to the broader academic community. Because of this, during the late 70s and early 80s, the semiotic/structuralist tradition of textual analysis became institutionalized in media studies and communication courses in secondary and university education in Britain. Most of the work produced during this time by, for instance, the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies had long forsaken literary models, and so contemporary discourse or academic critique around these issues were a lot more focused on addressing a new non-cultural studies specific audience. Fisk and Hartley's Reading Television from this time in 1978 even approach television as an oral rather than a literate medium and resist its incorporation into literary studies. They say that every medium has its own unique set of characteristics, but the codes which structure the language of television are much more like those of speech than of writing. Any attempt to decode a television text as if it were a literary text is thus not only doomed to failure, but is also likely to result in a negative evaluation of the medium based on its inability to do a job for which it is in fact fundamentally unsuited. Later on, they say, it seems then that television functions as a social ritual overriding individual distinctions in which our culture engages in order to communicate with its collective self. They would suggest that television performs a bardic function for the culture. Just as the bard translated the central concerns of his day into verse, television renders our own everyday perceptions into its specialized language system. Fisk and Hartley then divide this bardic function into several categories, all of which are tongue twisters to say the least. These categories include the articulation of a consensus about reality, the implication of individuals into membership of the culture, the celebration, explanation, interpretation, and justification of the doings of individuals within the society, the demonstration of the practical adequacy of the culture's ideologies and mythologies, and conversely, the exposure of any practical inadequacy resulting from changed social conditions, and the guarantee of audience members' status and identity. Of course, there's some overlap here, and not all of them are entirely useful, but it is important to note the explicit refutation of endearing popular demonologies of television. The second half of the book is much more concerned with individual textual analyses of television programs from Britain at the time, but there is some useful meta-commentary for cultural studies and its methodologies at the time. One of them, in a critique of the game show The Generation Game, states that the Generation Game, in its final effect, asserts the validity of non-competitive communal values within the structure of a competitive society, and is thus working within an area of cultural tension for which our society has not found a comfortable point of equilibrium. They go on to say that, so while the simple binary model of dominant/dominated may indicate the basis of our class structure, we must be wary of applying it too directly to the texts. A cultural text is always to a certain extent ambivalent. It never merely celebrates or reinforces a universal set of culturally located attitudes, but rather reflects the tensions caused by the many contradictory factors that any culture is continually having to reconcile in a working equilibrium. If Fisk and Hartley's analysis is ultimately limited by its textual focus, Richard Dyer's work, then, at least shows one way out of that difficulty. Dyer, another cultural studies contemporary, avoids any suggestion that he is examining the text in itself, the text as an independent, discrete object of analysis. Instead, Dyer is interested in the discourses used to construct texts and the social histories of these constitutive discourses. He also broadens the idea of the text by acknowledging the importance of extra-textual materials in the construction of any particular text meanings. The result is the mobilization of textual analysis in the service of the social analysis of discourse. In books like his 1982 work, Stars, he deals with the social and constructed meanings surrounding film stars and their semiotic value. Dyer examines the social construction of the image of the star through the full range of its representations: fan magazines, interviews, pin-ups, news stories, publicity, promotional material, so on, and how this is inscribed into specific film narratives. He reveals how stars accrue meanings that are relatively independent of the characters they play, but that contribute to their characterizations on the screen. Finally, he examines the ideological function of stars for society, how they manage to represent both the type and the ideal of the individual in society. Someone who is at once typical and extraordinary. While Dyer's work is most certainly related to the Birmingham School, his brand of screen studies is most closely identified with the British Film Institute, or BFI, in London, and the major film journal in Britain, Screen. While articles published in Screen did make important contributions to the development of textual analysis, the journal's prevailing theoretical position involved an extreme textual determinism. Because of this, the Birmingham School even set up a special research group to consider what eventually became known as screen theory. Screen's concern with semiotic explanations of the relation between language and the subject, and its interest in Lacan's view of subjectivity as an empty space to be filled through language, led it to foreground vigorously the role of representation and thus of the text in constructing the subject. Screen theory saw the process of interpolation, the way the individual subject is written into the ideologies of his or her society through acquisition of its language systems, as central and comprehensive processes, particularly in film and television. Texts are discussed in terms of their capacity to place or position the viewer, inserting or suturing him or her into a particular relationship to the narrative and into an uncomplicated relationship to dominant ideologies. This understandably provoked some argument, and among the most controversial aspects of this position was its apparently categoric character. Could we really say that all texts worked like this for all readers? As an American, I must say this next part feels distinctly British and kind of invokes a meme I'd see in making fun of British academia on Twitter, but nonetheless, this academic antagonism came to a head over the British docudrama Days of Hope. It dealt with aspects of British working class history from the Great War to the beginnings of the Depression, and was widely seen as a genuinely political critique of both Labour and Conservative Party policies over that period that established unmistakable parallels between the Britain of the 1920s and a contemporary Britain torn by inflation, unemployment, and battles between unions and governments. It was a particularly realistic piece of fiction, and it provoked outcry from the Conservatives who pilloried the BBC and its writer for their Marxist leanings. The academic debate over this reached epic proportions, and Screen replied through Colin McCabe, arguing that the generic form of the program, far from enhancing its progressive effect, actually rendered it unable to criticize society. This program's realism, as McCabe argued, is a set of representational codes that offers the viewer a comfortable position from which to see even bitter political struggles as natural or inevitable. Realism, the argument goes, precodes the reality it represents within common sense understandings of its world, so even when it depicts terrible happenings, we leave the text sighing acceptingly. The realist text, thus, cannot question reality or its constituent conditions without destroying the authority of its narrator, and since the realist text depends on the reader seeing it as reality, it cannot question itself without losing its authenticity. A progressive alternative to this would be a text that challenges viewers by questioning their common sense views of the world. And Screen argued this could be done only by breaking the conventional patterns of representation, by breaking with the dominant conventions of realism. This debate has been influential and long-lasting, and now we see the idea that the realist text is not so much read as simply consumed/appropriated straight via the only possible positions available to the reader, those reinscribed by the text. This idea is usually presented in a much less strict fashion now. Nonetheless, this debate is emblematic of Screen theory's insistence on challenging conventional textual forms because of their conviction that the text itself, rather than forces outside and prior to it, constructed the subject position from which the viewer made sense of it. Revisions of this position seemed to acknowledge the fact that Screen theory tended to isolate the encounter of the text and the reader from all social and historical structures and from other texts, which also position the subject. A strand of theory, however, from Screen and from this time which doesn't ignore the formation of the subject within other texts is feminist critique. In general, feminist criticisms of mainstream film and television argue that the way in which these media represent the world replicates other representational structures' subordination of women. For example, the pleasures of looking, of voyeurism and narcissism offered by Hollywood cinema are masculine and, in some genres, actively misogynistic. Despite the formation of each member of the audience as a separate subjectivity, and despite the polysemy of the text, we are not granted a temporary exemption from the ideological frames of our social existence when we enter a movie theater. This isn't to say there's no value offered by Screen theory in its focus on textual analyses, but just to recognize that the Birmingham School and the tradition of cultural studies was very much opposed to this. The foremost critique of Screen theory was David Morley. And it's important to note how Morley's own attempt to develop Hull's encoding-decoding model came to demonstrate instead that individual readings of television are even more complex and unpredictable than Hull's model would initially imply. A series of studies conducted by Morley conclusively undermined the linkage of particular readings with particular class positions, as if the working classes all read one way and the middle class all read another. They also revealed that making sense of television is an intensely social and interactive activity. It was also clear, however, that the subject positions produced by these other social forces were also unpredictable, disunited, and even internally contradictory. The subcultures group at the Birmingham School established approaches that emphasized the minority rather than the majority, the subordinate rather than the dominant, and the subculture rather than the culture. Studies of urban youth in Britain that drew on history, sociology, and anthropology had emphasized the strategies subordinate groups used to make their own meanings in resistance to those of the dominant culture. Not only did they negotiate with or oppose the dominant, but in many cases they actively appropriated and transformed dominant meanings. This all stems from the slow realization that culture is not monolithic, as in a sense is implied by the encoding-decoding models, but is made up of many competing, overlapping, and conflicting groups. Each of these groups defines itself through its distinctive way of life, embodied in its institutions, its social relations, its beliefs and customs, and its uses of objects in material life. This raises a concern, however, because The study of subculture is more than an essentially sociological study of the structure and shape of social relations. It becomes interested in the way that structures and shapes are experienced, understood, and interpreted. The effect is to turn the subculture into a text, its examination into a variant of textual analyses, and the interpretation of its meaning into a highly contingent activity. As a result of this finding, the definition of what constitutes a text broadened dramatically, and the new definition now included cultural practices, rituals, dress and behavior, as well as the more fixed and produced texts such as television programs or advertisements. The meaning of a text was also allowed to be more provisional, perhaps contradictory and subculturally specific. As a consequence, it became debatable whether or not the primary source of meaning was the set of social relations into which the text was inserted, or the specific forms of the text themselves. The text was dethroned. It lost its determining authority and its ability to determine how it would be understood by its readers. This pivots nicely into British cultural studies' focus on subcultures as a means of understanding text. Dick Heibdege, with his book Subculture, The Meaning of Style, was published in 1979 and offers a blueprint of sorts for this sort of research. In the book, Heibdege uses semiotics to interpret the meanings, ambiguous and contradictory, produced by subcultural dress, music, and behavioral styles. One influence on the approach is, of course, literary criticism, but another one comes from cultural studies' appropriations of ethnographic techniques. In pulling from Birmingham scholar Phil Cohen, Heibdege singles out Cohen's work for its linkage of class experience and leisure styles, and for its explanation of the relation between youth subcultures and their parent cultures. Most important, Cohen's explanation of the basic or latent function of subcultures provides the rationale for Heibdege's own reading of specific subcultures as text. For Cohen, the function of subculture was to express and resolve, albeit magically, the contradictions which remain hidden or unresolved in the parent culture. Within the book, Heibdege's assessment of the political function of subcultural style is probably its most significant contribution. The meaning of subculture, he says, is like any other ideological territory, open to contestation, and style is the area which the opposing definitions clash with most dramatic force. Further, subcultures are enclosed within the larger processes of hegemony, against which their signifying practices need to be set. Heibdege is most interested in those subcultural styles that seem to challenge hegemony, that offer an oblique gesture of refusal. There, the objections are lodged, the contradictions displayed, at the profoundly superficial level of appearance, that is, at the level of signs. Interestingly, almost 10 years later in his book Hiding in the Light, Heibdege would bid farewell to the study of youth subcultures by denying the connection between youth subcultures and the signification of negation or resistance, admitting that his argument was reinforced by punk's explicit political agenda and that subsequent youth movements no longer seem to articulate such a strong political resistance. He draws the useful theoretical lesson that theoretical models are as tied to their own times as the human bodies that produce them. In order to avoid this pitfall, Sarah Thornton, in her 1995 study of dance clubs, would focus on the discourses used to create hierarchies and distinction in the tastes cultures found there. While in many ways she reads these club cultural styles as texts, she also makes use of interviews and other sources of information that are more empirical in their foundations. She explicitly disclaims any interest in the relation between subcultures and resistance, and accuses the methodologies used within the Birmingham School's ethnographies as being empirically unworkable. Other works in this lineage have shifted away from the idea that the subculture is the object of study in favor of focusing more directly on the cultural networks which make up the contemporary experience of popular cultures. Here's where the ambiguity at the heart of British cultural studies, or really cultural studies as a field, really begins to emerge. Now, in the late 80s and early 90s, many have argued that, especially in the case of television or popular texts, this potential for resistant readings is in fact a property of texts themselves, and not merely of the audience members' socially produced methods of reading them. We see a shift back to the focus on texts, which were seen to be loaded with an excess of meaning, leaking through the boundaries of any preferred readings into the social formations of the readers, and thus producing a range of meanings and pleasures. In her essay Dance and Social Fantasy, Angela McRobbie resists the emphasis on social rather than textual influences on readers and audiences. She attacks the kind of subcultural and ethnographic research on youth discussed in the preceding section. Quote, "One of the marked characteristics of most academic writing on youth has been its tendency to conceive of youth almost entirely in terms of action and of direct experience. This has had the effect of reducing the entire spectrum of young people's existence implicitly to these moments, neglecting almost totally those times where they may become viewers, readers, part of an audience, or simply silent, caught up in their own daydreams. McRobbie would recognize that texts are indeed social formations as well, not simply raw material to be processed through other social determinants like gender and class. She would also critique her previous writing in saying that her own misunderstanding of pleasures of the text led to a devaluing of the reader's experience of it. The notion of pleasure has increasingly been placed in opposition to that of ideology. Whereas the meanings we give to the world we live in are socially produced, there is an argument that suggests our physical pleasures are our own. Without getting too deep into the nuances of these particular theories, the effect of these theories of pleasure is to raise the possibility that communication may have more consequences in the generation of meaning. Further, and more central for the purposes of this reading, where texts are seen to produce both pleasures and meanings, the two may well contradict or counteract each other. This even gives rise to the possibility that some marginalized individual pleasures may contradict and resist dominant ideological positions. To this final point, John Fiske's work represented perhaps the most logical development of this last possibility. Fiske identified the category of the popular with those pleasures he believes resist and stand outside the forces of ideology. He characterizes popular culture in general, and popular television in particular, by its ability to generate illicit pleasures and therefore subversive meanings. Here is Fiske attempting to address that very nuanced position. A close reading of the signifiers of the text, that is, its physical presence, recognizes that the signifieds exist not in the text itself, but extra-textually, in the myths, countermyths, and ideology of their culture. It recognizes that the distribution of power in society is paralleled by semiotic struggles for meanings. Every text and every reading has a social and therefore political dimension, which is to be found partly in the structure of the text itself and partly in the relation of the reading subject to the text. Ultimately, Fiske distances himself from such a position in order to explain how there is, in practice, no direct or necessary equation between popularity and ideological unity. To accomplish this, he pulls from John Hartley. Television's special quality, Hartley says, is its ability to produce more meaning than can be policed. Television producers deal with this by attempting to limit their program's potential for meaning, which will inevitably fail as ambiguity leaks into and out of the texts, an encouraging sign of the weakness of the tenure of any hegemonic meaning. This leakage is the result of semiotic excess, a proliferation of possible readings, and excess of meaning. In response to Hartley, Fiske suggests that this semiotic excess, not ideological unity, is intrinsic to popular cultural forms, explaining both their popularity and the apparent unpredictability of reactions to them. This explanation can be understood as an attempt to explain how popular culture seems on one hand to be at the mercy of the culture industries, and on the other to exercise a stout resistance and even subversiveness at times in its response to specific texts and their proposed meanings. In his later works, Fiske would see the popular in a rather Brechtian way, as a relatively autonomous, if subordinated, voice competing with the dominant for representation. The making over of the dominant meanings in popular culture is seen as a successful political strategy that empowers otherwise subordinated groups and individuals. Here we can see the serpent eating its metaphorical tail, as the textual focus in British cultural studies has effectively turned around on itself. And reaching this point in the history of textuality's development, Turner, the author of this book I've been summarizing this whole time, remarks that textuality must be merely a methodological proposition, a strategy to enable analysis, not an attempt to claim privileged status for a range of cultural productions. The category of the text, however, and explanations of the production of textual readings have become increasingly problematic. The difficulty is that from one point of view, texts are held to contain meanings inherent to their form, at least in the form of a set of limits so that one cannot read simply what one wants to off of them. They are also held to reproduce dominant ideological structures and thus must exercise some degree of dominance or preference towards a reading or group of readings. From the contrary point of view, however, texts contain the possibility of being read against the grain and producing resistant or subordinated readings. Mobilized by specific groups within the culture, they are also held to be historically contingent, subject to shifts in the context of their reception that can entirely change their specific meanings and their wider cultural significance. To deal with this contradiction, we can turn to Bennett and Wollicott's 1988 book, on James Bond, Bond and Beyond, the political career of a popular hero. The work attempts to survey the historical, industrial, and ideological field that produces its texts, the films, novels, and publicity connected to James Bond. The book contains analyses of the internal structures of individual texts, of the ways in which the meanings of the text might be historicized, of how Bond's meaning has changed over time, of the relationship between the films and the novels, and of the professional ideologies of the filmmakers, and how these might have affected the specific translation of the novels into film. This would seem to align the book and its project pretty firmly with audience studies, but they actually reject at least one of Morley's unspoken assumptions, that the varying readings of the one program are of the same text rather than the production of many multiple texts. Once the two distance themselves from the two major traditions of textual and audience studies, Bennett and Willicott develop a number of terms to help redefine the connections between text and society. First, they extend the idea of intertextuality, the system of internal references between texts. They introduce the hyphenated term intertextuality, which refers to the social organization of the relationships between texts within specific conditions of reading. The term inter-textuality forces analysis to move continually between the texts and the social conditions that frame the consumption and limit textual interpretations to specific historical locations. The intertextual relations examined and exposed at any specific historical point are seen to exert some force on the reader and on the text. This is not to suggest that texts are absolutely relative and bear no determining characteristics at all, but to emphasize the fact that texts do not simply contain set meanings they will generate, no matter what the conditions of their reception. Even relatively stable textual properties, such as genre, can be seen as cultural and variable, rather than textual and fixed. The two address this by examining the shifts in the ideological significance James Bond carries at specific points in the figure's history. These textual shifters allow us to chart the ways in which certain aspects of the figure are foregrounded in one ideological context and other aspects in another context. The work of the textual shifters does not merely produce different readings of the same text, but rather acts upon the text, shifting its very signifying potential so that it is no longer what it once was, because in terms of its cultural location, it is no longer where it once was. It is a different text. It would follow, then, that a text cannot have an entirely abstract meaning that is independent of what the reader makes of it. Texts and readers must generate their meanings in relation to each other and within specific contexts. Bennett and Willicott argue for a more genuine balance, for the recognition that texts, readers, and readings are culturally produced, and that one should examine their formation as a complex set of negotiations and interrelations. The problem actually remains one of practice, of actually carrying out such a program. While we might all theoretically accept the contingency of the text, in practice we all tend to see certain readings as inextricably bound into specific texts. Once again, we're led to the conclusion that texts are potentially both open and closed. Their readings and their textual forms are produced and determined by wider cultural and ideological factors. Though we can talk, as the two authors do, of the dominant construction of Bond in the 60s, for example, as if these limits are available and can be specified. We know that as soon as we specify them, we can be accused of trying to fix a singular meaning, or we can be challenged on just whose meaning we propose. Once again, we run up against the same contradiction that has plagued the entirety of British cultural studies up to this point. At what point does the text cease to matter? At what point are we investigating audiences rather than the text itself? At what point does my meaning matter? At what point does the cultural meaning matter? It's all very cyclical and all very tough to assess directly or with any particular methodology. One strategic response is to decenter the text altogether. Authors such as Richard Johnson or Stuart Lang, with Representations of Working Class Life, published in 1986, accomplished just that. Here, the analysis of literary, television, stage, and film texts is combined with intellectual and social histories to produce an account of the popular construction of the working class during these years. Studies like this adopt an approach to the text that usefully exploits the theoretical shifts we've been describing. They reject the Leavisite notion of the unique unified text, they acknowledge the historical determinations of text meanings for their audiences, and they are skeptical about the authority of the readings produced by the critic/analyst. Another point of progress is postmodernism. through its use of the idea of discourse. The notion of postmodernism has also challenged cultural studies to think about texts in new ways. The broad appropriations of Foucault's connection between discourse and power have explored the potential for new kinds of textual analyses. For some, this connection is used simply to move from analyzing texts to analyzing practices, while others suggest that Foucault's insights enable us to turn large, otherwise intractable sets of cultural industrial discourses and practices into texts. Even this, though, speaks to cultural studies' perhaps biggest weakness and among the most criticized attributes of the profession. As noted, the textualizing of social relations has extended the purchase of the category of text. Consequently, this trend has provoked extremely skeptical responses from other disciplines with different definitions of what might constitute acceptable evidence of social processes. Textual analysis inevitably focuses on the point of consumption rather than of production. In an attempt to remedy this, there are movements which have interested themselves in the audience more than the text before tackling that entire methodology in a similarly long-winded fashion. Let's turn to one last textual analysis with Nick Coldry's Inside Culture from the relatively recent 2000. Coldry's discussion is one of the relatively few recent attempts to return to textual analysis in order to reevaluate its usefulness as a methodology. What Coldry learns by looking at prior academics such as Hartley is that textual analysis must be transformed to take account of the actual complexity of textual production. Rather than focusing on the discrete text-reader relationship, Coldry proposes that we analyze what he calls the textual environment, composed of meanings, texts, and readers. The textual environment is constituted by a pattern of flows rather than objects and consumers. Coldry wants to investigate textualization, or how particular complexes of meanings come to be treated as text to be read within the textual environment. As a result of the incredibly varied textual environments which people encounter the text in, whether it be differences in ideology or aesthetic or physical space, texts that do attract close attention are not simply there as discrete objects. Rather, they emerge as part of a textual event which itself needs to be studied. The act of consuming the text is more important than the text themselves. He concludes his lengthy discussion by turning to another matter entirely. I quote, "We take pleasure in programs, in films, in novels, music, and dance, and these pleasures, well embedded in history, contain something left over which sociology has its own difficulty explaining, the realm of aesthetics. Cultural studies' displacement of the aesthetic and of issues of cultural value has become notorious and remains unresolved. Funnily enough, how aesthetics might even be integrated into a mode of cultural studies textual analysis is yet to emerge, although there are recent ventures in that direction which suggest how it might be done and how contentious the whole process really would be. Given the complexity of the history of textual analysis within cultural studies, and the distance it's traveled from its roots in literary studies, and the genuine theoretical problems, we can imagine how liberating it must have been to turn to the audience and inquire into how they actually read the texts. We'll see that over the second half of the 1980s, the notion of audience studies became the major influence on theory and the practice of cultural studies. In the next episode of Gallivanting Across British Cultural Studies, I'll be summarizing Chapter 4 of Turner's book, which in turn focuses on audiences. This was a doozy. There's just so much detail to try to adequately address in a summary format. Hope it wasn't too long. Thanks for listening. We'll see how long it takes me to make the next episode.